Well, Dan Wilson apparently isn't just the interim manager of the Mariners. No, we are fully in the Dan Wilson era now, apparently. Oh, and also Edgar's back. And of course, the Mariners couldn't have done all this without making themselves look bad in the process. So let's talk about it. Colby, hit it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ahoy, sailors. It is Friday, August 23rd, 2024. This is Tiding Gonzalez and Colby Patnode for the Locked On Mariners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, we have more context and info on the Mariners' firing of Scott Servais and the hiring of Dan Wilson. We'll give you our takes on that, as well as Servais finding out about his firing pretty much the same way we did, and Edgar Martinez making his return to the coaching staff. But before we do that, shout out to our title sponsor today, SupplyHouse. SupplyHouse.com is the reliable way to get parts fast. Shop for your next plumbing, h-vac, or electrical job and get fast shipping from coast to coast at SupplyHouse.com. And if you want to hear from me and Colby even more and help support the show, check out our Patreon. The link is in the description. You can sign up for a free 7-day trial. So Colby, you and I we're recording our Patreon show tonight. We're recording this on Thursday night because Colby's heading out of town when you're listening to this. And the Mariners made the official announcement of Scott Servais being fired and Dan Wilson being appointed the new manager. But we quickly noticed they didn't say interim manager in the title. And then you quickly noticed there's a difference there. I'm getting to it. And then you noticed they refer to him as the 18th full-time manager of the Seattle Mariners. And that didn't line up with what Ken Rosenthal reported earlier on Thursday morning. And we waited for a little while for Jerry Dipoto to speak to the media. And lo and behold, that wasn't a mistake. In the press release from the Mariners, no, Dan Wilson is the full-time manager of the Mariners. Like he's the guy for 2025 now, apparently. Now, maybe that changes during the offseason. We'll see, but highly doubt it. It seems like that's the plan. Like Dan Wilson is, at least as far as next year goes, going to be the manager of the Seattle Mariners. So I have some thoughts on that. Some pretty strong thoughts on that. I went on Ben Ranieri's show last night and shared some of those. So maybe you've heard them already. And if so, I'll give Colby the floor to share his thoughts first.
Just weird. The fact that they forego the opportunity to discuss.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
They forego the opportunity to go see if, can they go land a big fish? Can they go snipe somebody? Can they, maybe there's just somebody out there that they should talk to and maybe, you just to forego that when there's really no reason to, because you could name Dan Wilson the interim manager.
Yeah.
And if you decide you go through all the interviews and all that stuff and you decide Dan is the guy, just hire him, give him the job. So to me, it's very weird to just immediately jump to he's the full-time manager instead of going through a process and interviewing a lot of people, which to me kind of indicates this is what they've wanted to do for a while. Like they must have had some conversations with Dan about taking on a bigger role over the last few years. And they must really like what he had to say and all that stuff, because again, there's just no reason not to go out there and talk to other people, particularly people outside of your organization who might have, different outside perspective and might be able to help you that way. So it'll be interesting to see that. I'm also going to be interested to see what kind of coaching staff Dan can put together. I don't know how wide his network is around the game. And obviously, when you only work for the Mariners and you haven't played, a major league game in 20 years, like there's not, I think it's fair to question how wide the network is. Now, the reports is that Edgar is going to be named the hitting coach, probably. I mean, he might have already been as you guys are listening to this, but as of right now, the Mariners do not have a hitting coach on staff. DeHart has been fired. There's been no announcement made of who that will be. Jude is reporting that it is Edgar, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption. So I would also assume that Edgar is going to be here not just for the next 5-6 weeks, that he will accept the role on a full-time level, or he will just carry over and be on Dan Wilson's staff next year. Otherwise, there's really no reason for him to take the 6-week assignment. So, we've already seen one move made. Now, what does this mean for Perry Hill? What does this mean for Manny Acta? What does this mean for Christopher Negron, who we thought was, high up on the Mariners list? They're probably all going to have the opportunity to interview elsewhere at some point this winter. But again, how does Dan Wilson put together a staff? If he's got Edgar, what does he do? A pitching coach? Does he try to retain Woodworth? And by the way, how much control over his staff does Dan Wilson even going to have? Like, does he get to pick his staff, or is that going to be a Jerry thing, or are they going to work together?
Well, if he's already bringing in Edgar, right, but we also don't know if that's a directive of Wilson's or if that's a directive of John Stanton or Jerry Dipoto.
Sure, although that one seems pretty easy to agree upon. Like, I don't think there's much debate if it's a Wilson thing or if it's a Jerry thing. I think they probably looked at that and be like, yeah, sure. I mean, that's a no-brainer, at least in their mind. He's done it before. He did a pretty good job of it, at least as far as we can tell. And obviously he's very familiar with Dan. So we'll see what kind of staff he can bring. We'll see how much turnover there is. Typically speaking, there's a lot. But again, how wide is Dan's network? How many guys can he convince to come take these jobs? Does he have any, pull for other guys around the league, or is it just going to be past teammates and just connections to Jerry Dipoto, who's going to hire a good chunk of his staff? Did they just retain pretty much everybody except for Servais and DeHart? Seems unlikely. But yeah, so lots of different, avenues to go. Now that we know that Dan is the guy, if he was the interim manager, we really wouldn't be having these discussions, because it probably wouldn't be him who we'd have to worry about putting the staff together, right? It'd be the next guy's job. But, Dan has been in the Mariners organization as a coach, or he's had a role in the organization for the last 11 years, but that's just been with the Mariners. So we'll see how wide his net is. We'll see how much of a staff he builds. We'll see if does he want to retain Manny Acta, because Acta has a lot of years on the bench as both a manager and a bench coach. That might be valuable to somebody like Dan Wilson, who's never done this before. So lots of things going through my head right now. The biggest one is that it's weird to me that they forego the opportunity to discuss what is a pretty good job on paper. They forego that opportunity to discuss that with other, managers, retired managers, maybe, or bench coaches or pitching coaches or whatever. They just,
why would you shut yourself off from that? Why would you shut yourself off from an actual proper hiring process? And why would you do that for Dan Wilson? And I get it. Dan's a franchise legend. He's been working with the organization for over a decade now. He has probably the best thumb on the pulse of what's going on within the organization of anyone that's considered an outsider, quote unquote. He's been obviously, operating as a color guy on the broadcast for the last few years, on occasion. Almost as essentially a regular last year when Blowers was out. So he is very much aware of what's going on with the team. I'm sure he's cultivated some relationships with people on the coaching staff and obviously the players. We know about Cal Raleigh and his relationship with Dan, but still.
Sure. I think we should clarify something though, real fast here. I don't think we're saying that hiring Dan Wilson is a bad
No, but it's like, it feels like they felt like the need to jump at this opportunity right now and make these guarantees to him, where it just, who else is going after Dan Wilson right now? With all due respect, we
don't know. Maybe he was a hot name, or maybe he was going to be a hot name. We don't know.
Sure.
I think the important thing for me is that we're not saying that Dan Wilson is doomed to fail. We're not saying that Dan Wilson isn't the right hire at the end of the day. I think what we're saying is that it's tough for us to say definitively he is the right man for the job when you didn't talk to anybody else outside of the organization. And so, we'll see. I don't know. For all we know, the Mariners were in contact with Terry Francona and, hey, are you interested? Or some of the bigger names that are out there that don't have jobs right now. But again, and it's not that they don't know Dan Wilson well or anything like that. They know him pretty well. He's been very active with this franchise for the last 11 years, more so than, than the Griffey types, more so than the whatever. But you know what I mean? Like, it's not just been a ceremonial type of role for Dan Wilson. He's been putting in the work across the organization. So
yeah, and I don't mean to discredit that, and I'm not trying to.
No.
All I'm saying here is that
right?
this is a very big decision that you've made
Mhm.
in what seems to be a very quick amount of time
That you didn't have to make. Again,
Yeah,
the interim tag is there for a reason.
But that also leads me to what I find most suspect about all of this is the timeline of this decision and how it all came together. So I want to get into that in just a moment. But first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by Liquid IV and SupplyHouse.
I think most of us can agree that there is nothing better than enjoying an ice-cold beverage on a hot summer day at the ballpark. So when you're taking in America's pastime, don't forget to hydrate with Liquid IV's Popsicle Firecracker flavor, a surefire summer hit. Get hydrated with electrolytes, essential vitamins, and clinically tested nutrients from the #1 powdered hydration brand in America. Because baseball and summer go together like Liquid IV and indulgent hydration. Tear, pour, live more. One stick plus 16 ounces of water hydrates better than water alone. No more thirsty summers when you indulge in hydration with Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use the promo code MLB at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code MLB at liquidiv.com. Get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trades, SupplyHouse.com. SupplyHouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trade Master program. Every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at SupplyHouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at SupplyHouse.com.
And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Mariners kick off the Dan Wilson era tonight against the Giants. You can catch all the action on the Mariners hometown broadcast with SiriusXM via the SXM app. All you have to do to find that is search the word Mariners, the Dan Wilson era. That is weird to say. A lot has happened. It's been a lot longer for you guys watching now, but for us, it's still, 10 hours fresh. Been a lot to process, I would say, especially after the press conference with Jerry Dipoto today and all the reports that came out from that. So like I was saying earlier, the thing that gives me the most pause here, or the thing that I have the biggest questions about, is the timeline of this decision. Naming a full-time manager, making that decision for not just the rest of this year, but also next year, that's not something that you do on a whim. At least that's not something you should do on a whim. Jerry Dipoto said that they've been talking to Dan for the last 3 or 4 days. I don't buy that, frankly. And if it has only been 3 or 4 days, and they've made this kind of decision, this kind of commitment, that doesn't seem like great process by the Mariners organization.
Or Dan Wilson is one heck of an interview.
Right.
I mean, yeah, it's a little crazy. And then obviously the timing with, Dipoto going on the record yesterday with Rosenthal, and then the next day,
the very next day.
Right. Like not even, just barely 24 hours later.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of seems like this has been in the works for a little while. Which, I mean, I don't know how uncommon that is where, where, hey, we know we're going to fire this guy in a couple weeks, but
I mean, you do have to figure out who your interim manager is going to be. I get that.
Right. And
but he's not the interim manager. Like,
right.
That's
But
the
in
difference.
this case, maybe the idea was, hey, we're talking about, this, and you'd be the interim manager. And then they talk to him. And again, maybe he interviews really well. Maybe he's got a great plan. Maybe he's got more contacts in the game than we thought. And he's going to put together a incredible staff. Like, we don't know how this is going to play out, but just based on what we've seen, like what we know today as we're recording this, the 22nd, on the day Scott Servais has been fired, weird and suspect.
All signs seem to point to the fact that they, or the idea or whatever, that they have rushed into this. Like, they have gone, yeah, let's just do it. Screw it. Let's just give him the reins. Let's just give him the keys so that.
And that right there is what makes me really hesitant to believe that this is totally Jerry's idea.
Yeah.
Because if there's something we could say about Jerry Dipoto, it's that he is definitely not reactionary.
So that leads me into something that Ben and I talked about on his show, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Do you think that maybe, again, if this is more of an ownership-driven decision, while they're probably going to keep Jerry and Justin around at least for another year, like we talked about on Wednesday's episode, for all the reasons that we talked about, that maybe they are taking some of the control that they have over the on-field decisions, the on-field product in general. Obviously, they still put the players together and all that stuff, but like just kind of what we see on field and the collaboration we've seen between front office and coaching staff, that maybe some of that is being stripped away now. Because we talked about this on, again, now yesterday's episode for you guys. Back when we thought that Dan was just going to be the interim manager, how much of the reins was he actually going to have, right? Was he going to have the same control over things as Scott Servais, right? Because again, like we talked about, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to game planning, lineups, in-game decision, all that stuff. Scott still has the final say, but there's a lot of collaboration there. Could we see actually it's just Dan? Like, Dan just makes the decisions now? There isn't really as much there isn't any collaboration, or at least as much collaboration as there was.
I think it's the opposite way, actually. I don't think they can be more collaborative, but Dan Wilson has a total of 0 games of managerial experience.
Well, yeah.
Scott Servais had, at the end of the day, ended up with 1,300. So I do think that actually, it might be, Dan might lean more on his staff than Scott did, where it's possible Scott was like, yes, we're obviously it's still a collaborative effort, but at the end of the day, I have 1,300 games of experience here. I kind of know what I'm doing. So maybe I'll be willing to more willing to, move away from that plan than somebody like Dan will, who's probably going to lean on Manny Acta. He's probably going to lean on Edgar and on Woodworth, but I don't know. Like, again, because we have literally 0 evidence to tell us how good Dan Wilson is going to be at this. So we're just guessing at this stage, and we're guessing what type of manager he's going to be. We're guessing how he's going to, manage a running game. How much small ball is he going to play? My guess is it's going to look very similar to Scott Servais, at least for this year.
Yeah.
So,
well, I don't know how you with 5-6 weeks to go. I don't know how you install philosophies and get guys to buy into that.
Right. I don't
when they've been doing the same thing for the last 4.5 months. Like, Ben asked me about this on his show. I'll reiterate it here. We've obviously had a lot of discussion about what the actual impact of a manager is on the on-field success of a team, right?
Right.
To me, if they do find some success this year, like for the rest of the year, they actually do start playing better ball, I feel like that's just going to be purely coincidence. Because again, I don't know what kind of philosophies you're going to install. I don't know what you're going to tell these players differently that's just suddenly going to click and they're suddenly going to play better baseball because of that. I think if they end up playing better and it has something to do with Dan and Edgar being present, It's just because of their presence, right? And the absence of Jarrett DeHart and Scott Servais.
Just because it's different.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, it just kind of freshens up the vibe, essentially, in the clubhouse, which, I mean, that's essentially what Jerry Dipoto has said it was the goal in making this decision now, was to change the voice in the clubhouse. But when it comes from an actual philosophical discussion and how we want to actually play baseball and all that stuff, I don't think that you can change that on the fly.
You might be able to tweak a little thing here and there over these last 5 weeks, but I think Dan Wilson's real first shot to start to change culture and is going to be in spring training next year. I just think that, this is a team that's, while it's still pretty young, it is full of young veterans. And it's really tough to ask them to, hey, all that stuff we were doing before, scrap it. We're not doing it anymore. Because at this stage, you have very little to lose. Your odds of making the playoffs are basically zero at this stage now. But it's still, you don't want to make things worse. You don't want to get in players' heads or anything like that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, with Dan, obviously, and Edgar, how much difference can he make in a 5-week stretch? Probably none. Remember how excited people were about what's his name? I don't even remember his name anymore. Earlier. Yeah. Like, oh man, look, they were great for a week after, and then they went right back to striking out too much, right back to not enough contact, blah, 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 blah. So can Edgar change that? Probably not. I mean, he's not a miracle worker, although his track record, at least based on the only way we can judge him as a hitting coach.
Sure.
Pretty good the last time he was here. So we'll see.
It's just the thing that I'm still hung up on is the timeline of this and how this whole situation was handled.
I think the only way the timeline really makes sense is if John Stanton essentially started this process weeks ago, found Dan, or, found that Dan would be the guy that he would want, and basically started to inform Jerry that, like, hey, I'm thinking about making a change here. I'm thinking about, and I'll let you, I'll keep you in the loop. And then it would kind of make sense to me that John would be like, Jerry would do his interview yesterday, and then the interview was probably a few days ago, but and then John would be like, hey, Jerry, just so you know, I'm going to make this call on the off day. And Jerry's like, I've already done the interview. It's out there. It's public now. So would it shock anybody if John Stanton literally left Dipoto out of the loop so much that he pulled the rug out from under him at the worst time? No, because he's literally done it 3 off seasons in a row. So I'm not saying Jerry's blameless in this. He's absolutely
no. We need to get into that.
We'll talk about that in a second. But I think the initial decision, or I think why this broke down the way it did, I think it's because John Stanton was pushing for something, not necessarily behind Jerry's back, but that Jerry wasn't brought in on the decision-making process until later. And we'll probably never know that, probably too late when he was brought in to stop anything, but we'll probably never know that, because if Jerry does anything really well, he takes arrows for his owner really, really well. Like, he'll take the brunt of all the blame for how this was handled. And some of it's deserved. I don't think this particular part of it is that deserved. I would not be shocked at all. It's very easy for me to believe that Stanton was kind of working behind Jerry's back and making the decision here. And then, the timing of it all was just a giant mess up by Stanton. But the way the news was delivered, that still falls on Jerry.
So we'll get into that in just a second. But first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by TonaI.
For those of us who thrive on getting stuff done, including workouts, every minute counts. That's why you need TonaI, the smart strength training system that takes the guesswork out of working out so you can make sure you're making the most out of every rep. TonaI is the world's smartest and most effective strength training system that helps you get stronger. Powered by AI, TonaI learns with every rep so it can deliver workouts personalized just for you. TonaI learns from your movement and provides suggested weight recommendations for every move with detailed progress reports. They even create personalized program and workout suggestions or recommendations based on your individual goals. It's like having a personal trainer at home with you, as Tonal will optimize every workout just for you. Unlike traditional gym equipment, Tonal uses adaptive digital weight to advance your training techniques. From professional athletes to the Mama 3, Tonal is trusted by thousands who have become their strongest. Right now, Tonal is offering our listeners $200 off your Tonal purchase with promo code LOCKEDONMLB. That's Tonal.com and use promo code LOCKEDONMLB. That's LOCKEDONMLB for $200 off your purchase. That's Tonal.com, promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $200 off.
And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Once again, Mariners kick off the the Dan Wilson era tonight against the Giants. You can catch all the action on the Mariners hometown broadcast with SiriusXM via the SXM app. All you have to do to find that is search the word Mariners. So let's get into my biggest issue with how all of this was handled. Well, first and foremost, I want to say I have no issue with the Mariners firing Scott Servais. Okay? Like let's make that clear, right? I am never going to be the one that just comes out and says fire this guy, fire that guy, unless they do something that goes over the line, something that goes beyond sports, right? I want to try and handle this and do these shows, even though that I'm a fan, as professionally as possible, and I'm not going to just call for people's jobs. But I have pretty consistently said over the last few months, as this thing has continued to snowball for the Mariners, that it's sports, right? At the end of the day, a team's failures are going to reflect on the people that put the team together and spearhead the team, right? Managers, coaches, GMs, presidents of baseball, football, basketball, whatever operations, right? At the end of the day, you continue to fail. And now, you look at what happened last year after ending the drought. And then this year you blow the 10-game lead at record pace and yada, 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 all the things that we've talked about. That's going to reflect poorly. That is going to ultimately fall on the shoulders of the guys that are, of the organization. So this didn't come as a surprise, and I'm not critical of the Mariners for making this decision. I'm not. I really, really am not. Whether there's a nuance, there's nuance to this discussion and all that stuff, and was Scott actually to blame? All of that. There's a lot of stuff to talk about there, but at the end of the day, this is sports. This is entertainment. This is ultimately what happens when a team fails to meet expectations. That's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm. But I hate the way that this was handled. Absolutely hate it. It had been floating around for, 20 or so minutes before the press conference that, Scott didn't know, right? He found out the same way we did, right? He read the article or he saw it on TV or something like that, right? And then Jerry Dipoto just outright said it to the public. Like, they didn't try to sweep that under the rug or anything. He just outright he just told people, like, we didn't tell Scott. Like, Scott found out through other means. How is it that Ken Rosenthal found out and had enough time to write an entire article about it before the guy who got fired found out about it? How was this decision made? And no one thought to immediately tell the guy that they decided to fire, right? Who the decision was all about. Hey, you've been fired, right? Mm-hmm. How did that not happen immediately once the decision was finalized? Once you have Dan Wilson in place, once you know this is happening, that the first thing you did, or how is it that the first thing you did was not telling Scott Servais? How did that happen? And if you're Jerry Dipoto, right, whether Jerry decided this, whether he, whatever, right, he knew about it. He absolutely, obviously knew about it. how is his first thought not to tell Scott Servais? And if his first thought was to tell Scott Servais, but he was told not to, like he was instructed not to tell Scott, why? Why?
Yeah. The news broke around 10:30, right, this morning. So you're just kind of trying to think logically here. I'm not quite sure how long the flight from LA to Seattle is, but my guess is that Scott didn't get into town and didn't get back home until probably, I don't know, 2 in the morning or something like that. So I think the thing that you would do normally is you would call the guy, say, hey, we need to talk to you tomorrow, be here at this time. And it sounds like the Mariners did do that. Like they were going to talk to Scott today. And according to Dipoto, the news broke a couple hours before they were scheduled to meet with him. So my guess is that like they were going to talk to him at about noon or whatever. And then they were going to, and you just kind of follow through here. The official announcement comes at about 3:30. So I think, they had a plan in place, but obviously it gets leaked sooner than that. Scott, because they played a night game last night, because they got in late, he probably wasn't going to be in the office that early. But I think, at that point you have to call and be like, look, Scott, not gonna, BS
you know what our meeting is about.
Right. And, it's, we still want to hear from you. We still, want to do this in person, but we would rather you find out this way than from getting a social media alert on your phone. So, the meeting is about your termination, blah, 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 and all that. So, just poorly handled. Just logistically speaking, that's my guess as to what happened, is that a late night game, getting in late, all kind of contributed to a later meeting than they would normally have. And then unfortunately the news leaks and boom. And it's still not handled well. And it's still ultimately on Jerry. We think, again, I will not put anything past John Stanton ever in terms of scumminess. But yeah, I think ultimately, Jerry wore it today like he's going to every single time, but Jerry wears it every single time the ownership screws up. So again, I'm still not willing to put this past ownership. I'm still not willing to put this past ownership leaking either. But it just, anyway, whoever, however, doesn't matter. It sucks. And it is a really, really lame thing to do to Scott, who has been, incredible in the community. He's been incredible, in the clubhouse and all that stuff. Obviously he's going to have some haters. He's going to have some detractors, fine, whatever. But overall, good guy, good man, cares about his players, did a lot of good for your organization.
He deserves better than this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's nasty work. Absolutely. 100%. Terrible. Like this is not at all how this should have been handled. Right. And this isn't the first time this has happened. Even recently, like Ty France found out the same way that he was gone as well. So I don't know why this continues to happen. And I cannot whatsoever figure out why this team just absolutely, utterly refuses to just be normal.
I'd be careful here because I do think this is more and more commonplace where teams or players and all that, they find out things on Twitter now because things get leaked before they're official, right? So
Still,
it's kind of,
Ken Rosenthal knew before Scott Servais.
I get it, but we need to stop pretending this is just a Mariner thing. Bobby Wagner found out the Seahawks released him from Adam Schefter.
I know, and he's his own agent and all that. Yeah, I get it. I get it.
Stuff happens with even like organizations that we would all agree are like really good at this stuff.
Right.
This stuff still happens. So just be careful to be like, the Mariners are the only team that could screw this up. No,
but with all the other things, with all the other bad PR moments for the Mariners, especially in the last calendar year, how are you this bad at this?
I don't know, man. But like I said, I laid out what I think probably happened. Does it matter? Not really. You still screwed up. But I think, my theory of why this leaked sooner than they could tell Scott, I think it's pretty accurate. So if you're looking for an actual like guesstimate or estimation of how this happened and the timeline in which it happened, it's probably pretty accurate that way. Does it matter? No.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Because at the end of the day, I mean, like Jerry said, it made an already, I don't know what his exact wording was, but it made an already uncomfortable discussion even that much more uncomfortable.
Difficult discussion, that
Yeah.
much more difficult.
And it's very clear Scott is pissed about this. And Scott put out a statement and thanked literally everyone but Jerry Dipoto and Justin Hollander. I don't know if he thanked John Stanton.
He said ownership. He gave him like 15 words.
Right.
So
yeah. I totally understand why Scott would feel that way, especially with someone that he was teammates with, was coworkers with for a long time, absolutely considered to be a friend. Now, I have heard, and I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, that relationship hasn't been as great between Scott and Jerry over the last few years, but still.
Typically speaking, relationships between head coaches and GMs is not been that great.
Right.
So I don't know if that's uncommon.
Right. And Scott has obviously had to deal with a lot of things that are not necessarily his fault. Right.
Right. So yeah, I just saying, like, first of all, I don't know how many times friends like Scott and Jerry work together like as closely as they have. But I would say that, like, it's not uncommon to hear friction between front office and management, because again, management makes the moves or front office makes the moves, and management has to deal with it. They have to pick up the pieces. Right. And so that can obviously fracture and all of that stuff. So hopefully, at the end of the day, pretty raw right now. I'm sure Scott is, hopefully Scott will at some point in time, reach a level of, what's the word? I just hope that Scott, looks back fondly overall on his time in Seattle. And I think he will. Right now it's raw. So right now he's upset. And I know he said some nice things about, the fan base and the city and all that stuff. And it was appreciated. But I do think ultimately at the end of the day, Scott will look back on his time in Seattle. He'll think of it fondly. And I do think he'll return at some point to kind of, take his rightful place in Mariners history as, one of the good guys and one of the best man, probably the second best manager in Mariners history. So, things are raw right now. So I don't read too much into the statement. I don't read too much into him not mentioning Jerry and Justin, but also I don't really care if he doesn't want to. It's his statement. He gets
and I don't blame him with the way that this was handled.
Absolutely not.
That's going to do it for our show. But before we get out of here, a reminder that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. For Colby Patnode, I'm Ty Gonzalez. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at LO_Mariners. You can follow me at Ty Gonzalez and Colby at CPAT11. That's CPAT11. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. Now, have yourself a beautiful baseball day, and we'll see you next time. Peace.